Welcome to the Common Security Bootcamp. This is the first session. We're going to be talking about an introduction to security, and my name is Robin Tatum. I'm the Director of Security Technologies at Help Systems. I'm also certified as an auditor and one of the IBM champions. So it's my honor and pleasure to be here with you to talk about such an important topic, something that I do day in and day out. Please make a note of my email if you have any questions. I'm certainly happy to answer any of those either via email or via social media. Now, our topics today are pretty numerous. We've got a lot of content to cover, so we're going to get started with a couple that I'm sure you're just dying to learn more about, which is starting with risk policies. Now, of course, a little bit of a dry topic, but we need to understand the motivation behind why we're talking about security. We know that cyber threats are increasingly dramatic every year. An IDC study shows that 60% of organizations indicate that they have breached or been breached at some point in their history, with half of those experiencing a breach within the past 12 months. Those numbers aren't for last year, so they've probably increased even more because we've certainly seen a dramatic increase. This is represented regardless of where you live. Globally, it's around 60-30. In the US, it's even higher than that. And Europe doesn't get away scot-free. Their numbers are very similar as well. Part of what we've got to consider is the fact that obviously the world had a very systematic change in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. All of a sudden we had a lot of people working from home, and literally overnight it transformed many of our organizations in a way that we had never anticipated. That has represented itself in the subsequent years as now increasing costs as it pertains to data breaches. So for the first time in 17 years, we've hit the highest point in cost of a data breach, now exceeding $4 million US, and I don't think that that's a coincidence. We know that the remote work has increased these costs, partly because we've introduced other factors now, like devices at home that are not potentially under immediate control of the IT organization. We can also report that one of the most common attack vectors comes from compromised credentials. I'm not surprised by that. I've been telling people that for years, but it now compromised or comprises of about 20% of the breaches at an average cost of over $4 million. So if you are, thinking, well, nobody can get to my IBMI, what you need to think about is the fact that a lot of users will leverage the same user ID and password not only for their IBMI, but also for the network and maybe their LinkedIn account or Pinterest account or Facebook. And in many instances, those credentials are stored in a password dictionary on the dark web and perhaps being used to attack your environment. The data that you store on your IBMI system isn't necessarily all created at an equal pegging. Data classification is a process that we use in order to really go through and identify different classifications or sensitivity levels of data within the database. Now, by doing this data classification, we benefit from a potentially reduced scope when it comes to securing that environment. If not everything is created equal, we focus our attention on what is most important, and we work our way down to the information that is perhaps more public or more accessible. Here's an example of data classification that's been broken down into 4 classes. Now, this is entirely up to you. We just broke this down in a very simplistic manner, ranging from publicly accessible information, which, let's face it, we're probably not going to expend a lot of effort around securing, all the way up through internal use only to confidential data and then highly restricted data. We're going to start by securing the highly restricted information, and that may be restricted based on the value of the data. It could be restricted based on the fact that our business runs on that information. So we can classify data in a number of different ways. We need to ask, though, 3 important questions as part of that process. Number 1, has your data been classified? Has the sensitive data in the database been located? For many of us, as we develop our applications over the years, we discover later on that the database is perhaps not normalized very well, and we have relevant information, maybe driver's license information or a national insurance ID or a social security number, and it's scattered all over. And we need to make sure that we've located and identified all that information. And then, of course, we need to understand how it has been protected, if it has. I listed here some common ways. The menu system, that's obviously a common approach to locking users into an application environment. Maybe we take their command line restrictions away, although sometimes users can run commands off this platform without the green screen that a lot of people don't realize. Applications, object level security, encryption, typically not heavily used, but what we do throw into the mix more often than not is a bit of a wing and a prayer. So if you are one of those shops that has an expectation of your environment being secure, but you really don't have any understanding of how that's been accomplished, or arguably if it even has been accomplished, then this is an important stage for you to determine all of those things. Are you dealing with a regulation? Many of us do. Sarbanes-Oxley, covering publicly traded organizations and other countries' versions of that. Here in the US, we have HIPAA, which is overseeing personal information related to healthcare. We have PCI, which is for credit card information. That's a worldwide regulation. The European Union has GDPR, controlling data associated with the citizens of the European Union. So there's all of these different regulations that are designed to control access and use of data. If you're not processing credit cards, you don't store that type of information, you don't work in the European Union, maybe you're not publicly traded, you may be answering this question that, no, I don't have a regulatory directive. Everything I do is just because. And that's good. It's important to have kind of due diligence as part of one of your security initiatives, but everybody should at least have a corporate security policy. Now, this is something that is not necessarily a single document, a single page document. It's going to really map out the requirements that your organization should be following, and the employees, contractors, vendors, business partners should all be following when it comes to system and database access. This type of document should be defined by a committee. It's not something that should be created by one user within one server environment. Even if you're a security officer for IBMI, arguably you should be interpreting the security policy and applying it. You should not arguably be the one who is initially defining it. The benefit of using a committee is that we can have representations from various areas of the business, and we can utilize that in order to get sponsorship by management. Sponsorship from management is important because without it, we're not going to get funding. We're also going to be struggling with implementing it and then, of course, enforcing it. I had a customer a number of years ago who said that their security was somewhat lacking, especially in terms of passwords, because we determined they allowed one-character passwords, simply because the CIO didn't want the users to have to be bogged down with password information. They felt that the IBMI was inside the firewall and that everything was golden. Problem is, at that point, if you try to propose that you should go up to 10 or 15 character passwords, you're simply not going to be able to enforce it because the management level was not understanding and acknowledging of the importance of that. Your security policy should start at a corporate level. It doesn't have to be technology centric right out of the gate. We want to identify the purpose of the policy, what it applies to. There may be different divisions within the organization. We may be represented by different geographies and therefore may be carrying regulations that are different in one part of the world versus another. The security policy should lay out any expectation the user has to privacy. If there is the ability to monitor, we need to tell the users that. Not because, we're trying to catch them in the act, but the benefit of notifying users of the possibility. Number one, it sets the stage if there is a violation that you have grounds for following up on it, but it also deters users that may just be casually overstepping their bounds versus maliciously and deliberately doing so. We eventually need to get to the server access policies, maybe how the password should be established, and which applications should be accessed by which groups of users. Part of the regulatory compliance part is the conversation around those regulations, frameworks, and benchmarks. So we're going to talk about that next. Again, we're going to keep it brief. We don't want to get too bogged down in this, but it's important that we understand the kind of practice behind it. So when we talk about regulatory compliance, there are really two sides to that. One is industry regulations. An example of that would be PCI. There's no government mandate that says how you behave with credit card data. So this is an industry regulation managed by a body of the credit card processors. We do also have government regulations. HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley are all examples of that. That's where the government has stepped in after some egregious breach typically, and they've established some of the minimum basic standards that people should follow with the hope that that type of violation will not happen again. The standards are really there to act as a guideline. They give you the minimally accepted level of operating procedure. They are typically going to be built upon what we call a framework, so that we're not reinventing the wheel with each regulation. They often require interpretation, meaning that they are written in a language that may not be familiar to you and I. As an auditor, I see a lot of documents pertaining to regulations, and I will tell you quite categorically, I have never seen one that says how IBMI should be set up. They usually only outline a basic minimum, meaning that by following the regulation, there is an expectation that at least the basics have been accomplished, but does not necessarily equate to everything being done that should be done. They are imprecise, they are non-technical, and they're nothing more than a roadmap. Now, the decisions about how these